This is, I would say, probably the most relevant of all of these lectures to like your personal life. This is one that I think you can take a lot from and apply to individual relationships with just one other person, to any of the groups that you're a part of. Ultimately, what we'll see through the rest of the class is that cohesion's the goal with all of the stuff that we're going to talk about, with influence, with power, with conflict. All of these different things all kind of wrap up into this idea that we're trying to create these strong bonds between people, because when we have cohesive groups, we have really positive outcomes in terms of productivity, in terms of satisfaction and health measures from individual people. So today's lecture is going to be kind of in 3 different components. So first we'll talk about what cohesion actually is, and what are the kind of indicators and the requirements for getting there. And then this is honestly one of my favorite topics here, and this is the one that I think is really applicable to people's daily lives, is really understanding what stage of group development you're in the relationships that you're in, and what are the strategies to move from one stage to the other to get towards a more cohesive relationship. And a big part of that is embracing conflict. I think that's one of the things that I want everyone to kind of come away from this class with, is that conflict is usually a good thing. It's the only time that it's a bad thing is when it's ignored and put under the surface and not worked through, because conflict is what builds structure and builds positive connections in the future. So we'll end by kind of looking at why cohesion is a good thing and what it produces in terms of productivity and satisfaction and health and all of that kind of stuff. So this is the part this is honestly one of my favorite. And like when I was making this class, I mean, I've been doing kind of social neuroscience for 5 or 6 years now. This was something that really kind of hit me in terms of my own personal relationships, in terms of like my coworker relationships. It really gives you this thing to look at of like, okay, where am I at? How can I move from this stage to the next one and really improve the relationships in my life? And so this is one of these overview slides. We're going to get into each of these, but these are the stages that these groups go through. And I have a slide at the end that kind of talks about this not being like a step ladder, that you're like going through these to get to the end. A lot of this is dynamic. You can be moving back and forth between different stages. But we'll go through these one at a time. And I've mentioned some of these before in class.
Is your rhyming scheme that you put together here?
Is there a rhyming scheme? Oh yeah, no, that's research. Okay. Gotta love these.
It makes it kind of easier.
Right. It would be so much better too if the like acronyms spelled something and like. Oh yeah, they do. So the forming stage. So this is something that I have mentioned before in class, and this is that first day of class. The whole like icebreaker activity that we did was all to kind of get past the forming stage, because the forming stage is very confusing. It's very ambiguous. We're sitting here not really knowing what the intentions are of the people around us. We don't know what their opinions are about certain things. Like we're not going to open up about our politics. We're not going to open up about our spirituality, about our religion. All of these things that can be hot buttons, like this is when we have pretty high walls up. There's not much eye contact. There's really formal posture, right? You're not in this like open postural position. You tend to kind of be on the lookout around you for what everyone else is doing to kind of figure out what you should be doing. There's a lot of social comparison happening. And a lot of it is to this idea of kind of avoiding embarrassment, right? You don't want to be that person in the group that everyone's looking at and judging, right? And so a big part of this is, you're not willing to tell other people about yourself yet. And so the big kind of push past this is why like icebreakers are such a big thing in like team building activities and stuff, is because you need some way of breaking those walls down, of getting people to engage with one another, of getting people to look each other in the eye and actually talk to one another and start communicating. Because once that inhibition kind of goes away, then you start to kind of open up a little bit. You start to test the waters. You start to lay out little things and say like, okay, I'm kind of getting a feel for how similar you are to me. Maybe I can open up about this part of myself, maybe this part of myself. A lot too of what happens when you start opening up is you start to collect information about the group itself, right? You try to see what everyone else's intentions are in the group, what they want to accomplish, what the goal of the group itself is. You start to ask about who's in charge, what the roles and norms and rules are of being in the group. Right? There's this search for information. And it's this kind of self-organizing principle, right? Once you start doing that, then you start to kind of figure out all of this stuff. You start to figure out whose roles are whose and who's supposed to be doing what. Leaders emerge through this. You start to see this organization starting to form. But what always happens, and this is something that I just am going to say throughout this entire class, is that conflict is the rule, not the exception. There's always conflict. Our goals do not align with other people's goals. This is like Nietzsche's whole thing. It's about like, I am trying to accomplish something. I'm trying to be my true self, but you are trying to be your true self. And those are going to collide with one another. And we often are in situations where we have to be there. We have to work with these people. We have to have these relationships with these people. And so a lot of the times what happens is you have people that don't like each other, right? And so they're just constantly clashing with one another. They can't figure out how to coordinate their goals. They can't figure out how to coordinate their activities. They just don't want to be around each other. There's a lot of conflict that happens over how we're doing what we're doing, right? It's usually the case that like we're all on board with like what the group is trying to accomplish, but there's a lot of conflict that comes up about how we're going about that, how we're breaking up our goals and our sub-goals and really working towards things and who's doing what and what the roles are. But there's also, especially in our culture, there's this kind of need to climb the ladder, right? And to differentiate ourselves, to be in higher positions and prestigious roles, to be in leadership roles, to have control and authority. All of this produces some level of tension between people. The problem is when that tension isn't addressed, right? That's what leads to resentment. That's what leads to just these long-term conflicts of just constantly feeling like you're just in the worst environment you've ever been in. It leads to anxiety. It leads to depression. But, and this is just kind of another point I was getting at. So a lot of this conflict ends up coming out about the leader itself. And I'm sure many of you can relate to this, is that you have a boss that's got a lot of power and a lot of control and is able to scapegoat people, is able to say like, this isn't my problem, this is your problem. They're making a lot of the big decisions, and so you can be upset about kind of the direction that the leader's going. What's really interesting though, and this is something that I want to keep in mind, especially as we get into kind of leadership and management type ideas, is that leaders have a really hard job. And you have this case that happens almost every time, is that at the beginning, people are like, yeah, you're the leader, you got this, we're behind you. You do one wrong thing and everyone's questioning you. Everyone's questioning whether you're on the right track, whether you're the person for the job, whether they might be a better person for the job. And the way that these groups are structured is usually there's a lot of people underneath the leader, right? A lot of people that can question your motives, a lot of people that can question why it is that you're doing the thing that you're doing. And you're constantly in this, this balancing act between trying to accomplish what the group needs to accomplish, but also trying to build relationships within the group, trying to manage that. And it's really hard to be someone's boss and to be their friend at the same time, right? And so like, I want people to have a little bit of grace towards leaders by the end of this class, because it's not an easy thing to do, and you see that it just kind of breaks down over time. But what I was kind of getting at before that last little bit threw me off was that this conflict leads to structure if you let it. And so much of the time, groups get stuck in this stage, and you can get stuck in this stage for a long time. I know I've been in situations, I've had jobs that I hated, and I just went to work every day and I dealt with the same crappy people every day, and I never really did anything about it, and I just hated it. I was constantly thinking about how I hated it. It was affecting my personal relationships outside of work. And what really needs to happen, and this is something Think about this too, not in terms of some type of group that you're working with, right? You're not the boss that you're working with. Think about this in terms of your personal relationships, spouses, with friends, with brothers and sisters. A lot of the time, we bury this conflict. We say, like, it's not worth it. I don't know what's going to happen. I'm afraid of what's going to happen. And so you just keep going through the same cycles over and over and over again. But what the research shows is that if you actually acknowledge the conflict, if you actually try to work through it, you go into this structuring phase. And this is the goal in any type of conflict, is that the conflict is there to give you some kind of an idea of how to work through this in the future. You're not going to, both the people in this situation are probably not going to change to a high degree. But what can change is the boundaries. Right? You can set healthy boundaries around the conflict, and you can say, look, if this comes up again in the future, let's agree to approach it like this. Let's try to change the cycle of the behavior that we're at so that we can actually get along with one another, so we can work towards the same tasks, we can work towards the same goal, right? And so the ironic thing here is that most people, when they're afraid of conflict, this like fear of what's going to happen, that this person's going to blow up or whatever, the research shows that most of the time it doesn't go that way. Most of the time it leads to higher levels of intimacy, right? It's like, yeah, this does suck. And it's really cool that we're acknowledging that right now and that we're trying to do something about it. We're trying to build some kind of a structure around that conflict. It leads to higher cooperation because you have a target now, right? Instead of just complaining about the problem all the time, you've agreed on some kind of target on how to approach this thing in the future. And it's something that in that conflict, if it comes up again, you can point at it and you can say, look, we came up with this solution. Like, I'm still on board. I don't know if you're still on board. That's another going back to the storming stage and then back into the structuring stage, right? But it helps to produce some type of consensus. It helps to really bring people to the same page so that you can make decisions together. And it's the only way around resentment. And resentment sucks. You have these situations where each individual within that group, when you look at the collective like stats, like this guy is really good at this and this girl's really good at this, collectively they should be accomplishing these really amazing things, and they just aren't. And a lot of that is because of all of this, that there hasn't been this structuring to make the environment predictable, to make the environment safe, right? That's really what it's about, is like, I feel safe being here around all of these other people. And when you think about like Maslow's hierarchy, right? The whole belonging part, the social part, is right above like physiological needs, safety needs, right? And if you can't get past that, your brain is in that mode all the time. You're constantly thinking about like, oh, what do I need to do to get this person to like me? Oh, he's pissed off again. Oh, what did I do? And your brain just perseverates on that over and over and over and over again. When the real way out of that is through this, is creating structure, right? Then you don't have to think about it all the time because you've come up with a plan, you've come up with a goal. Yeah, this really hit me when I was creating this class, of just like, the idea of structuring conflict and the fact that conflict is not a bad thing. It's an indicator, right? It's something that says we need to change course. And that's something that's really cool about being human, is that we can actually reflect on these things, right? We can look at our past actions, we can look at our past behaviors, and we can make the choice to change. We don't have to keep playing the same cycle over and over and over again. And the really cool thing is that once you get through this, once you build this really nice structure, once you kind of work past this conflict and create a safe environment, you become productive, right? Like, people want to be there. They want to be a part of that group. They want to work towards that group's goals and that group's values. And this is a really interesting one, that when we think about leadership and when we get into kind of the leadership lectures, the balancing act between task and relationship. So much of what you see in the corporate world is this task, 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 right? Numbers, numbers, numbers. And there's like such an emphasis on don't socialize, don't talk to other people, right? But what the research shows is that if you allow people to socialize early on in group formation, by the time you get to this stage, people aren't talking about personal stuff anymore because they've already gotten that out. They know who each other are. They've shared those personal things with each other. And so now when they're at work, they're talking about work. They're talking about helping each other, working towards the same goals. And this is where a big kind of shift happens between a lot of the communication and the conversation being around like what the group is. That's what a lot of the structuring is about, to how to accomplish what the group needs to accomplish. This is when people really start getting on the same page and working together. And yes, this is the companies failing super early on. They don't get to this stage, right? They don't become productive. They don't have a cohesive, safe environment that people really want to work together and coordinate together. But this is kind of what I was just saying, is that this isn't something that just happens over time. This is something we have to engage in. We have to challenge ourselves, right? We have to push ourselves to actually confront the conflict instead of just habitually going through it over and over and over again. It's so easy for us to just like accept the devil we know instead of the devil we don't. But like, guarantee you're going to be happier if you actually try to work through stuff. And it's a lot easier said than done, because I've gone through this lecture a couple of times now, and I am still not perfect at this. There's still a lot of conflict in my life that's really freaky. And I'm sure it's the same for all of you, right? It's just like, I don't want to rock the boat. I want to keep things the way that they are because I don't know what change looks like. But you don't know if you don't try. You can't predict the future. There's so much of our attentional resources that are spent on worrying about what can happen. And when you really think about how much time you just spent doing that instead of how much time you spent actually coming up with a plan, right? Like, and when you really think about how the brain works, the brain is kind of designed to accomplish goals. And it's not going to accomplish goals unless you give it a goal to accomplish. So the last stage, this happens to pretty much any group that's ever existed. Societies are the only exception here. Cities continue to get bigger, but companies, groups, they all die eventually. The civilizations do too. I mean, you look at Rome, you look at all of the empires that have come before now. I think America's hopefully not on its way down, we'll see. But yeah, this is something that can be planned. It can be something that just kind of spontaneously happens. And when you really think about that, I mean, a lot of things can go into this, right? You have this planned thing where it's like, okay, this group was formed to accomplish some very specific thing. And once it accomplished that, then it's done. The other side of it, though, is it ran out of money, right? And that happens all the time. I mean, when you look at the amount of companies that die on a daily basis, it's pretty staggering. But the other one is when things just kind of don't go well. People kind of go their own ways and things just kind of fall apart on their own. Been in lots of just like journal clubs and random stuff like that where people get busy and just kind of goes away. But this is kind of the rule here, right? Is that if you think back to one of the slides in our previous lecture, group membership is economic, right? I'm in this group because this group is providing some type of benefit to me, right? It's providing me with a sense of belonging. It's providing me with acceptance. It's providing me a paycheck. If the rewards are not greater than the costs, then people start leaving, right? So if I'm investing all of this time to be a part of this thing and I don't feel like I belong and I'm not making money, then there's no reason to be there anymore. And that's usually what ends up happening, is that the group itself kind of loses its purpose, loses its direction, has a really hard time motivating people to want to be a part of it, and things just kind of start to fall apart. So this is just a reminder, though, that this is not this progression where you're trying to get to the end. Like, you can think of tons of cases where you work through some kind of a conflict, you build a bunch of structure around that, you become really productive, and then something else happens, right? Some internal conflict erupts because people don't like each other. You have new members that you're bringing in that don't mesh with the group as a whole, and you have to build new structure around that, right? So this is a continuous dynamic process where you're constantly kind of circling back to these older things, right? Thinking about like your individual relationships. Just because you figured out that problem doesn't mean that you figured out all of your problems, right? And so you may have a really good track record now with getting through that kind of conflict, but this is a constant set of work that you have to put in. And that work takes a lot of energy. That's why we avoid it, right? It's a lot easier for us to just go into habitual mode and not use our frontal lobe, which is like super costly. But that was kind of what I was getting at earlier, right? So a lot of the issues from the earlier stages can occur later on. And a lot of this, like I said, is bringing new members in. It's new conflicts erupting within the group that didn't exist before, whether that's liking, whether that's about new goals and procedures. I would very much, like the two stages that I would focus on the most are probably the storming and the norming phase. The storming and the norming. God, who did this? Right? The conflict stage and the structure stage are the ones that really are what I think produce the actual products in the end. And they're the ones that take the most work. So this is kind of the thing that most people in this research world look at, is that cohesion is this health indicator of the group. It really shows kind of whether or not that group is going to hit all of these marks on tons of different levels, like I just mentioned, like satisfaction and health of the individuals and productivity, all of these things. And it's something that promotes, promotes retention. People want to be in cohesive groups and they want to stay in cohesive groups, right? And if you're in a really cohesive group and you're connecting with people and you're able to rely on these other people, it helps not just you reach your goals, but it helps everybody kind of collectively reach their goals. So these are just kind of examples of the different things that this touches, right? So this is a big concept. I mean, the whole idea of love is really kind of wound up into a lot of this. Brene Brown, a big clinician, talks a lot about love and belonging. That love and belonging usually are said in the same sentence when you're talking to people, that it's this feeling that you're a part of something, right? So satisfaction and turnover, the morale, the stability of the group itself, but even equal influence in groups and reduction of conflict. So this is just kind of an overview slide because we're going to get into each of these individual components here, but this is just to highlight that there's a couple of different angles that you can look at cohesion from. There's not just like a typical cohesive group. So some may be really cohesive in terms of their social relationships. People really like each other. But just because they like each other doesn't mean that they necessarily work well together. That's going to be more of this like task cohesion of really being able to coordinate their actions and their goals and achieve things together. And then this third one is going to be more of a perceptual thing. This is something we talked about on the first day of class, entitivity. And we'll kind of get into that in a second. And the last one is something that I know we've all felt. It's this elation, this emotion that comes with feeling like you're a part of something. When your group is all really happy, it kind of spreads through the group, right? It's this effervescence. So we'll start with social cohesion. So this is, in terms of like exam question, it is very much about liking and disliking other people. It's about the attraction that people have within the group to each other, right? And the way that it's usually measured is that you give a survey to everyone in the group that just has everyone's name, and it just says, are you friends with this person? Do you like this person? And you're able to create these kind of network diagrams that show how much liking there is in the group and where the outcasts are and all of that kind of stuff. And you can also see, you can ask people too if they have other ties to people outside of the group, because we'll see that really cohesive groups tend to have people that have a lot of ties to the group and not a lot of ties to people outside of the group. But there's two different ways that this can kind of play out, right? So we can have attraction at the individual level where we're talking about people being attracted to one another, right? This is friendship, this is family members, all of this kind of stuff, the liking that's between individuals. When you're looking at things on the individual level with this type of social cohesion, if that's really what the cohesion is all about in this group, is the individual members liking each other, then that means when the people that are really well liked leave the group falls apart, because that's what was holding it together, right? But on the other side of that, we have kind of this group level attraction. And this is kind of that push and pull that we talked about earlier on in the class between kind of individualism and collectivism, kind of. This is being attracted to the group itself, the message of the group, right? Like, I really want to be a part of what this group is doing. I'm attracted to the group itself. And when that type of attraction is there, individual members that are really liked can leave, and it doesn't really tear the group apart, because the people that are staying there because of the message, because of what that group represents to them. So, but for this one, really just focus in like social cohesion is attraction. Because if I have exam questions, it's about how to differentiate these four from each other. So task cohesion, on the other hand, is about what the name implies, right? It's about working towards some goal, some objective, right? And it's about how well these people can coordinate their actions, can coordinate their goals, their motivations, so that everything is in line, so that they're all working really well together as a team. So I have a picture of a team here, right? And it produces this sense of being able to rely on one another. There's this interdependence that kind of arises from this, because when I can see that you have my back, that you're going to take care of that responsibility, and I can take care of this responsibility, then it allows for us to really share resources with one another, to trust one another. And so this is something I already kind of mentioned, but big part of this is goal mediated, right? It's about trying to win the championship, or trying to get your sales up in a company that you're in, right? Get a product out to market on time, like those kind of things. And so this one's, in terms of research, has been really focused on team sports, on military squads and things like that. And so when you ask a bunch of team members about the type of cohesion that they experience, most of it is centered around this idea of teamwork, which when you kind of break down is really about this whole task cohesion idea. That like, you're going to take the left, I'm going to take the center, you're going to take the right, and we're each going to do our jobs, and we're going to get the ball in the goal. But I mean, that's just in terms of like a leisure activity, but this is really, really important in the corporate world, in building successful teams that are able to accomplish the goals that the company set out. So this one is perceptual. So this one is all about how groupy the group feels, how groupy the group seems to be, right? From the outside, if someone was looking at all of you sitting around, would they be able to say, that looks like a tight-knit group? And I have these two examples here on the side that kind of explain this, right? So down here on the bottom, we have just a bunch of random people walking down the street in New York, right? If you were to look at that group of people, you wouldn't say this is a group, right? But all of these people are all doing the same thing. They're all engaged in the same activity. From the outside looking in, you'd say, look, these people are all a part of something. There's a high entitativity there. So, and this is something we've mentioned before in like the identity lectures, is that when you have a really high perceived cohesion, a really high entitativity, you tend to talk about your group experiences using plural pronouns. We did this, we accomplished this. And this gets into that idea of, I think the reason I really like the identity lecture so much is because it really ties into a lot of this stuff, right? As you become more enmeshed in the group itself, you start to lose some of that personal identity, and you start to adopt the group as part of yourself, the values of that group, the goals of that group. And the last one on here is the emotional cohesion. And so this is about how it feels to be a part of that group, right? The confidence that everyone shares with one another, the commitment that everyone shares. Like this is a big one in the Army crew case, right? You have that JV team that's just like, we got this. Like they have their slogan that they have, like there's this shared feeling of accomplishment and of reliance on each other and enthusiasm, right? And this is kind of what I was mentioning earlier, is that these positive moods can tend to spread through the group, right? You have Durkheim, the sociologist, talked about this like collective conscious, that somehow we're all kind of getting on the same wavelength. And there's actually some really cool research that shows that we actually do get on the same wavelength, that our brains actually start to fire in really similar ways when we get really close with one another, when we experience these types of emotions. They've done this with like guitar players that are jamming with one another, that are like on the same wavelength, and their brains start getting in sync with one another. It's really wild. And this is a really important part right here, right? So this is when that collective kind of feeling is really high, when that group is part of your identity, then when something good happens, it's really intense. It intensifies the feeling itself. There's something about sharing that positive experience with other people that makes it that much better. And the research shows that this is a lot stronger for positive emotions than for negative ones. But I think the negative ones are still really strong because they can send you on a downward trajectory. I mean, think about the team that loses every one of their games. Like that shared, like, we're not very good. It's pretty strong too. So, and this is from all of these different cultures from around the world. Like, there's always been some type of term to describe this. They've used this in military settings a lot, right? You have like Napoleon talking about the success of his army was about the morale, right? How committed everyone was and how they shared this sense of commitment and confidence with one another is really important in terms of like actually succeeding. Figure that. If you believe you can succeed, you might actually succeed. So élan, morale, esprit de corps, positive affective tone. That's your $5 research word for the day. Every time you try to read a new literature, you have to learn a whole new language. They're all talking about the same thing. Cool. So we'll shift a little bit and we'll talk now about kind of how the membership unfolds and how we can kind of achieve stability within the groups that we're a part of, right? And so the big thing to kind of hone in on here is the fact that this is something that takes time. And when you look at, I think I have some stuff coming up here in a little bit, but like the reason why researchers have a really hard time studying groups is that you can't build cohesion overnight. You can't stick a bunch of people in a room and say like, you're all bonded for life, right? And so a lot of the times what you see is that experiments that are happening in the lab don't really translate to the real world. They're trying to show that like this happens in groups, but it's really hard to create an artificial group and come to this level because this is something that develops. It's something that happens over time. There's two types of groups that you can really think about in terms of membership. And so in terms of exam stuff, the only thing I want you to remember here is that open groups are less cohesive, closed groups are more cohesive. So open groups are ones in which you're replaceable, essentially. Like you can leave and come as you please. Like, I mean, this is a lot of work settings that you've been in. Like it doesn't really matter if you leave, there's someone else that can fill that role, someone else that can fill that job. And so in those situations, especially when people know that they're replaceable, it's really hard to get to a high level of cohesion. And then closed groups on the other side are ones where you really know that like this group is not going away. A really obvious example of this is like a family, right? I mean, there's probably a lot of situations where families do fall apart, but most of the time they're ones that you know that that relationship is still going to be there. Even after conflict, after whatever you've gone through, that is something that you can come back to. And so a lot of the times in these closed groups, friend groups, tight friend groups tend to be like this, right? There's no competition for membership. It's like you're there for each other. And so with that in mind, you know that there's going to be future stuff to do with these people, that you're not replaceable. And so with that, it tends to increase the level of cohesion that you feel. And if you feel like it's a closed group, if you feel like you're a part of something and that you're not replaceable and that you're not just going to like get put off to pasture, then you're more willing to really engage and to think about these kind of long horizon goals, work towards them, towards some collective outcome. So these ones, this is something that we've touched on a lot, is that from a management perspective, you really want to deal with smaller groups. If you try to stick 8, 10 people in a room together and expect that you're going to have this amazing like bonding happening, it's probably not going to happen because it's really hard for us to delegate our attentional resources to a lot of people, right? So if you put people in smaller groups, it allows there to be more equal influence between people. It allows people to really kind of get to know one another and open up to one another. There's a lot of research about classes that students tend to learn more in small classes. So gotta love those, 520 lecture hall, like look around and half the room is on YouTube or Netflix. Like, why are you even sitting here? And this is what I was just getting at, right? So as the group increases, the amount of relationships that you have to maintain gets kind of unreasonable, right? There's a researcher named Dunbar that Dunbar's number, he kind of calculated the reason that tribes are the size that they are, the reason that groups are the size that they are is because we can't really maintain a ton of positive ties with people. And ones that we're constantly maintaining, that we're constantly reassuring, that we're being reciprocal with, that when people are doing positive things for us, that we're doing positive things for them. I'm sure that a lot of you can relate to the times in your life where you're really, really busy and you don't have time to put any attention into the relationships that you're a part of, and that they tend to falter because of that. There's a lot of kind of decisions that have to be made about kind of where your priorities are in terms of relationships and how they fall in terms of the tasks that you need to accomplish. So the groups that have a lot of structure tend to be really cohesive too. And so this is, I think, going to be our next lecture. But these are ones that have a lot of norms in place that really dictate what you're supposed to do, what you're not supposed to do. Oops, come on. There we go. And so these are some examples of what a structured group would have, right? So there tends to be some type of a leader that's kind of directing a lot of this stuff and settling disputes, trying to build structure around the conflict that's happening. But this is a big one, and so this is going to be what we talk about a lot in the next lecture, is this idea of social norms. It's something that, like, there are very clear rules about what I'm supposed to do in this given circumstance, what my role is, who I can talk to, who I can't talk to. Some of this can go, I think, a little bit to the extreme, because I know you've probably been in really highly structured environments that are so structured that there's not any room for relationship building. And that can be kind of the other side of this, but these are kind of the general rules. So there's not a lot of subgroups that have split off. So this would be in terms of, like, if you're thinking about the large group, right? The large group is less cohesive, but these subgroups within themselves can kind of have a level of cohesion. But if you're talking about the whole group itself, then it tends to be more cohesive if it hasn't split into a bunch of different groups. They tend to have a centralized structure, which is what this picture is kind of showing, is that there's this organization that dictates kind of who does what, who has what influence, what the direction of communication looks like. So you don't need to remember a lot of these. Dense structure just means that there's a lot of people that are able to make ties with one another. This is kind of an obvious one, this low number of isolates. So an isolate would be kind of the loner that nobody likes. I know that's a sad way to say it, but like, but yeah, if you were to do some type of sociogram, it'd be the people that don't get selected by anyone as being a friend or being liked. So the cohesive groups are ones in which everyone kind of has this reciprocal and mutual liking of one another. And this is what I mentioned earlier, is that cohesive groups tend to be kind of exclusive. Like, this is my group, and I don't have like a lot of friends outside of my group. And when that is the case, you have a lot more time to divest in that group, right? This is something that like AA promotes, is this really high connection to AA and this kind of shutting down of other ties outside of the group to really build a level of cohesion and to get you onto the idea, the values that the group is promoting. This one's really interesting. And so I know that a lot of people have probably been in sororities or fraternities, but even just other types of groups that you have to work to get into, right? Even professional work environments, right? I mean, you're all sitting here in a college class to be able to get a job that requires some type of proof that you put in a ton of work. When you get into that group finally, there's more commitment from you because of the work that you put in for it, right? And so if there's some type of requirement to get into this group, then there's gonna be more of a commitment from the people that are there, right? They want to be there, they want to form relationships, they want to make that a part of their identity because that's what they've been working towards. And so that tends to increase the cohesion. And these tend to be really attractive to people, right? These are groups that seem important, that seem like, oh man, if they have all of these rules to get into it, then that must mean like this is the bee's knees. Right? Right? Thought I'd throw that out. Yeah, I think the 40-year-old version says that at some point in the movie. No. And this is kind of what I was getting at, right? So the membership is something that you earned. It's something that you really put a lot of your time and your effort into. And so it's something that really helps you be a part of it. And so when you look at the opposite side of this, when you have some type of a group that doesn't have requirements to be in, but also doesn't have rules to stay in the group, right? A lot of these groups that you're a part of are like, if you want to stay in this group, you need to work hard. You need to, if it's like a fraternity or a sorority, you need to have the grades that come with membership, right? You need to do the service that's required in here. But these groups that don't have that are ones that it's really easy to leave, right? If you have this group that you put all of this effort in to be there, you have this, they call it the sunken cost fallacy. It's like I put all of this time in, and even if it's not like doing what I want it to do for me, I'm like so unwilling to leave it because I put so much in, right? And so you have this just like Tuesday yoga class that you go to. It's like, yeah, whatever. Like I can leave that. It's not a big deal, right? And so these groups that have these really strict rules, they tend to monitor the members really closely, right? And so they tend to have these hierarchies of like who's working the hardest, who's putting in the most effort, give them higher membership and better like access to whatever the group offers. This is a tactic that groups know really well, and that's why they do these things. So from a research perspective, right, so if this really is the health indicator of a group, then how is it that I'm going out then and really looking at a group and seeing, okay, is this one of those cohesive things that they talk about, right? And so one of them is the social network type stuff. So these are the sociograms that we talked about earlier in the class. So you're basically just asking who's friends with who likes who, and you're building these maps that show all of these connections. And you can see ones that have tons of ties that are all the way across and kind of to everyone are really cohesive. Ones where there's just not a lot of order or structure to it tend not to be. One of the other ways is observational, right? You can just go out and you can, usually you have a lot of stuff that you're looking for when you go. You don't just go observe and just write down a bunch of random stuff, right? So if you're a researcher that's interested in kind of the social cohesion, whether people are attracted to one another, then you might be kind of monitoring and writing down about like who's engaging with who and how often, who's communicating with who. You're going to note these instances of conflict, when tension builds. And you can also look at just how successful the group is, how coordinated they seem to be. I mean, this can be in terms of like cognitive coordination, of being able to know where the other person is going with what they're wanting to do, but it can also be kind of physical coordination. If it's a task that requires actually like moving in some coordinated way, if it's a team sport or something like that. And then this is the other side of it. Instead of observing, you're actually just asking people to report themselves on some of this stuff. And so you can have these scales that get at the different levels of cohesion. So how liked do you feel? And do you feel like there's a high attraction in the group? Do you feel like there's a shared commitment and confidence in the group? Do you feel like there's that someone on the outside would see you as a group, right? These are questions that you can get at. And you're not going to usually ask that straight out, but you can create questions that kind of get at that idea that you can kind of average across and see whether or not it's getting to what you need. Just remember, though, that these are very biased. So this is something I mentioned earlier on in the class. I think that there was a question on the test about this, but this is going to come up a lot, is this constant balancing act between task and relationship type goals and procedures, right? It's really easy if there's a lot of deadlines, if there's a lot of really important stuff that needs to get done, to completely forget about the people, right? And just to focus on the goal. But at the end of the day, every single person in that group has a need to belong. Every single person in that group has a need for recognition, right? And so if you don't fulfill those, you're putting yourself right back into the conflict stage, because those people don't want to be there. And so this was just kind of a good management tip here. If you ever end up in a situation where you're the one in charge, is that if you're doing really heavy task stuff, then when those tasks are completed, or even if they're not completed yet, you should probably follow it up with some type of team building, some type of relationship activity, something that allows people to share and connect. Because I mean, just even like happy hours, right? Just like going out and like, even if you don't drink it, but like just sitting down with someone in a comfortable environment where there's not this pressure to be your corporate self or whatever it is, and you can actually open up and share things with other people, is really, really powerful. So, and this is just kind of what comes out of the research, right? So if there's a really good balance between these things, you tend to have a lot higher satisfaction. The influence tends to be a lot more even in the group. You don't have people that have a lot of power over other people. And overall, the group is just more productive. So the idea here in terms of exam stuff is that the balancing act is task and relationship. When you ask Navy SEALs about this too, this is like, they don't use the words task and relationship, but they do use the words trust and accomplishment. Like, they want a leader that knows what they're doing and that they can trust, that builds some type of cohesion within the group. There's like entire books written about it. Cool. So these are just kind of what cohesion creates. It's stuff that I've been hinting at the whole lecture, so it's going to be a lot of repeat stuff, but people are more satisfied when the group is cohesive, and that's a really obvious thing. Like, if you like the people you work with, you're probably going to be happier, right? But like I said, it's something that takes a lot of work to get to. This is why it's really hard to create experiments that capture this, because it takes a lot of time, it takes a lot of effort, working through things with people, right, to actually get to this place. Less anxiety, less tension. So this is a really interesting point here, though, that we haven't really touched on, is that Let's say that you are a part of a really important group to you, something that was super cohesive, some type of club you were part of, some type of sport that you were part of, even a really intimate long-term relationship, right? When that relationship ends due to having to move, some type of social mobility, you tend to go into a psychological state of not knowing whether you can ever get there again, right? That like that was it. Like it's so hard to get to cohesion that now you're feeling lonely. You're feeling a bunch of guilt about the isolation that you're in, right? So, I mean, this produces changes in your brain chemistry. And there's a lot of evidence to support the fact that like people that are constantly isolated, that constantly feel like they've been left out, that their reward pathways stop working, right? And so they are actually at a lower level of dopamine on average. So when they do experience dopamine, it's like the greatest thing in the world. And it leads to a lot of dependency issues. It's this hole. Like when you really look at why people use drugs, use alcohol, whatever, they're covering something up a lot of the time. They're filling a hole that's there that they're not getting from this other stuff in their life. And this is hard to come out of because when you look at this, right, you have this person, sure, a lot of you can relate to these feelings at different times in your life. How hard is it to pull yourself out of that, right? You get into another group situation. Are you in a position to promote cohesion? Are you in a position to actually connect with other people? Or are your walls so far up that you're not going to open up? You're not going to share. You're not going to try to build any type of meaningful relationship because you're still so stuck on this one that you lost, right? I'll say it again and again. One of the most amazing things about being human is being able to reflect. We are the only animal that we know of that can think about what happened and change, right? We're not just constantly in this habitual way of doing things. And so this, knowing this, having this insight gives you something to think about, to meditate on, whatever you want to do, whatever way you want to feel about this. But if you can notice this, you can pull yourself out of it. Because I guarantee you there's a lot more opportunities for cohesion in life. Plenty of other fish in the sea. Right? So this is one that's going to come up later in the course. This is a really interesting thing that happens. Cohesion is usually a really good thing, right? It increases the like internal dynamics, right? So everything that we've talked about so far, influence tends to be really shared among people. People feel like they belong. But what happens is that when groups tend to become really cohesive, you start to see this really high pressure to conform, right? We talked about structured groups being really cohesive. And so when that structure becomes so rigid that conformity is just expected of everyone, people start to become really afraid to challenge the status quo in these cohesive groups. And so cohesion is usually a really good thing, but this is a warning sign that it is something that you need to watch out for because it leads to what they call groupthink. And groupthink can be really dangerous. And this happens at really high levels of power and control. An example that's before even my time, but JFK and the Bay of Pigs, there were a lot of people in the room that knew that it was a bad idea, that knew that everything was going to go to crap if we went in and we attacked Cuba in this spot or whatever. But there was such a high pressure to conform, there was such a high pressure to agree and to not make waves that nobody spoke up. And it led to these just disastrous decisions that were made. And so this is something that you'll see in groups that kind of get to this level of kind of toxic cohesion. You start to see a lot of hostility and a lot of scapegoating. You start to see this like beating the nail down.
How did it get to this?
And it's really interesting. I think that we'll get into it in one of our lectures, but that incident actually caused him to change a lot of how he approached leadership in the future. He started to start meetings without saying his opinion first, so he allowed everybody else to say what they had to say. He encouraged minority dissent of like people that weren't high-ranking members. He wanted to hear what they had to say, and he wanted to hear honesty from people. So these are things that you can avoid if you can see them. But one of the hardest things in life is insight, right? How do you know you're here? How do you know that you're on this groupthink path? I think that there's a lot of danger in this right now in our society. Think about these like really high pressures to conform and how scary it is a lot of the times to share your opinion about something, right? Without immediately thinking that all of the stereotypes associated with that thing are just going to get lumped onto you, right? This is a really, really scary place to be because it leads to the suppression of individuality, right? You can't really be your own creative self if there's this really high pressure to conform. I think we just have a couple more slides here. So this is something I've hinted at this whole time, but there's a little bit of nuance here. So are cohesive groups better performers? Are they more productive? Usually yes, but it doesn't emerge in all groups, right? So here's what I've been hinting at this whole lecture is that the relationship is really strong in real groups, right? Weird. But you don't see that in these laboratory groups that were just put together one day, you're the blue team, you're the red team, go. Doesn't work like that, right? Correlational studies rather than experimental studies, same idea. Correlational studies are usually looking at groups that already exist and seeing which groups are the most successful and which ones aren't based on these different metrics. But you also see it in smaller groups. So that's something we've come back to a lot too, is that you see this cohesion in the smaller groups. The interesting thing that comes out of this when you think about productivity is that there's some type of emergence happening, right? It's not necessarily that this group is made of a bunch of individuals that each on their own are better than all of the individuals in this one, right? It's the fact that somehow this like cohesion, this coordination between them produces something that's greater than the individuals that made it up. And so I think it very much depends on situation, right? And the types of tasks that someone's working on. Probably see this a lot stronger in team sports and in military squads. So those are ones that really need a high level of coordination, right? But if you then look at like a group of people at a call center, that each individual person is not really reliant on the other person to do their job, you're not going to see the same type of productivity, right? And so you have, when this says weaker, don't take that to mean that it's like really weak. It's just saying that sports are the strongest, military is behind sports, non-military real groups are behind that, and then weakest in artificial groups that we've kind of hinted at, right? But what that shows is that the groups where coordination is really, really important are the ones where the productivity ends up being a result of high cohesion. And so this is an interesting question. It's a chicken and the egg question, right? Are cohesive groups better performers because they're cohesive, or did they perform better, or did they become cohesive because they were good performers? So what we see is that and this ties in very, very well to the Army crew study, is that when a group performs well, there's this shared elation, this shared confidence, right? It produces a higher level of cohesion. That higher level of cohesion leads to better performance in the future. When you fail, it produces disharmony, disappointment, and a loss of morale, which decreases cohesion and leads to more failure in the future. They call these upward and downward spirals, right? So if you keep failing, then you end up in this mode of saying like, well, we're just not good enough, I'm not gonna try. One of the things that we've touched on a lot is the conflict, right? Is that a lot of this stuff needs to be brought to the surface, needs to be discussed, and needs to have some type of structure built around it so that it can be avoided in the future. If there's a bunch of disharmony, if there's a bunch of disappointment, a good thing that a leader can do is instill hope, instill some type of message, instill some type of value, right? And say, look, we're not failures, we can do this. It's the whole like Hollywood speech that they give, right? Structure is expensive, right? So we talked about cohesion being something that's built around structure, but let's say that you're a small company that's trying to accomplish really big things, but you don't have the money to have enough people to fill all the roles. So you have people filling multiple roles at the same time. You don't really have the money to create some type of organizational structure, to create a book of all the guidelines and rules, to create opportunities for your employees to have relationship type building activities. Like, there's a lot of that built in. So a company like Google, performance, they succeeded, they got more money, and they were able to put that back into it. And I think that that is one of the marks of a good company, is where they're putting those resources back in, right? If they're successful and they're putting that back into the actual employees and they're making the employee, that usually leads to more performance in the future. One of the things to think about here is that those identity principles, right? Is that the really successful groups are the ones that can create a message that you yourself are like, yes, I want to be a part of that, right? I want to be a part of this company because of their values, because of what they're trying to accomplish. And then if you're in a group where you're just like, yeah, I'm here to make money, but like, this sucks. Like, I don't really care about what they're doing. Like, they're kind of exploiting me. University. It hits your motivation, right? And it produces this kind of downward spiral, right? So, and this is the motivational speech, right? Positive feedback results in more cohesion than someone, and there's a lot of coaches that try to take this other approach of really like harping on you for how bad you were, right? The research shows that's not successful. It might be for some people that have like dealt with that their whole life and have some type of like really strong internal striving. But most of the time when you tell people they suck, they don't take it well. It creates beliefs that change your behavior. I mean, we talked before in this class about the math experiment where they told women that they were bad at math, and that group was worse at math than the group that they didn't tell that to, right? The beliefs that people instill in you affect your future motivation. If people can't see the end goal, then negative feedback is destructive, right? If I don't see myself winning the championship and then I'm told that I'm terrible, then like, I'm not gonna try at all, right? But if I really believe that I can do it and something bad happens, then there's something in me. I mean, I think that that's what will is resilience, right? And that's what willpower is. Like, okay, something bad just happened, but I can still see the end goal. I can still, like, I'm gonna take all of this and just keep pushing through. And I think this is the last slide, I believe. So what makes these cohesive groups more effective, right? And so there's a lot of things that they've talked about, that they've seen in the research. Big one is coordination. This is something I was hinting at earlier in the class of like there might actually be like a brain mechanism involved here, that people's brains are actually getting on the same wavelength and allowing for better coordination. But there's a safe environment, right? Everybody's on the same task. They have the same model of what we want to accomplish and what the process looks like to get there. A big one is that everyone is contributing, right? You don't have freeloaders. You don't have people that are just there to rake the rewards in without putting any work in. Whereas the non-cohesive groups are disjointed, right? They're not able to really get on the same page as other people. There's freeloaders, there's uneven productivity, there's not this desire to really put in everything that I can. And that was one of the big things I was getting into as far as like successful companies, that there's not a lot of commitment to what that company is trying to achieve. So, and this gets at what we were talking about earlier, that it's very experience dependent, right? It's situation dependent. So if the task itself requires a lot of coordination, then the cohesive group is going to be a lot better than the non-cohesive one. So I have all this rope up here. I'm not planning on kidnapping anybody, but I have a fun activity for whoever wants to stay. That's where we'll end the lecture today.